Hello, Max Wright here from Success Council, and the topic of minimum wage came up in the State of the Union address by President Obama recently, and I just wanted to discuss some of the horrific consequences that will occur as a result of this. So this is kind of the reality of minimum wage laws. So this is yet another example of one government program causing an absolute disaster, and then the solution being another government program which will make it even worse. What am I talking about? Specifically, what I'm talking about is the education system. So we have a problem in that it is an absolute tragedy, but there's large numbers of high school graduates coming out into the workforce, and they have just not been given a proper education. It's a state-run education system, and the outcome is horrific. So these poor people have had their youth wasted when they could have been acquiring skills, acquiring knowledge that will help an entrepreneur or someone who owns a business, who will help them add dollars to their bottom line. And that has been wasted. And the result you get is a high school graduate who is worth, for round numbers, let's say they're worth $5 an hour to an employer. Now, an employer likes money. If this person had the skills and was capable of adding, say, $20 an hour to their bottom line, then of course the entrepreneur is going to say, well, I'm going to give you $15 an hour in order to get $20 an hour. That's a win for me. But the problem is, because the education system, the government-run education system, is so terrible, these young adults are entering the workforce and they're worth maybe $5 an hour. So now an entrepreneur is sitting there, it's like, I've got to pay you $5 an hour, sorry, I've got to pay you $10 an hour, $11 an hour, but you're only worth $5 an hour. That's a loss. I don't want to participate in that. So what you're going to get is a lot of unemployment, right? For people who are worth less than the minimum wage, they are unemployable. And the reason they're unemployable is not because they're terrible human beings, not because they're just innately not good or of low value. It's the government-run education system that has let them down. So now, this has been going on for decades, and it's a really big problem. So you have, I think I read a report about 6 months ago. In the state of New York, 80% of high school graduates could not read at an 8th grade level. I mean, this is a huge problem. Young adults are entering the workforce. They can't read the employment contract that they're given. They can't read the instruction manual on the piece of machinery that they're being asked to operate. They're of very little value to the chain of production, right? They're of very little value to entrepreneurs and business owners, and so therefore they're next to unemployable, especially with minimum wage laws. Now, the employer could rectify the disaster of government education by employing them at a low wage. Right? Yes, it might be below a living wage. This is a disaster caused by the government education system. Right? This person has very low skills. What the employer could do is say, well, I could employ you for $4 an hour, even because you're only worth $5 an hour. So I'm still making a buck. That's cool. And whilst you're on the job, you'll get on-the-job training. Your skills will increase. A year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, however long it takes, that person has now acquired skills on-the-job training, and they're more valuable. Now their wages can go up. And this is not theory, this is not like made up stuff. This happens all over the world. I mean, look at China, for example. 30-odd years ago, you had this whole society raised in this communist nightmare, and the quality of education was just horrific. They were just indoctrinated to love the leader and all this kind of nonsense, right? And they were unbelievably worthless, almost, to the means of production. So what happened was, but there was no minimum wage laws. Greedy capitalist people can come from outside, Americans let's say, and build factories there, and they could pay them $1 an hour. And it was terrible working conditions. But having said that, they were earning 50 cents an hour before that, or even less. So the capitalists came in and offered them $1 an hour, doubled the quality of their life right there, right? But it's like, here, poor person who tragically grew up under this communist regime. Here's a pair of scissors. Here's how this works. Okay, 50 cents an hour, start cutting cloth. You're now of value to me. Okay, cool. Whilst you're cutting cloth, look over there. See that? That's a sewing machine. That's how you start watching that, watching what that person's doing. In your spare time, you might be able to get a little bit of on-the-job training on that. And soon, your skill set's higher. And now I can afford, you're of more value. Now I can afford to pay you more. You fast forward this, a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, and you look at China. Hundreds of millions of people in the last 2 or 3 decades have been lifted up out of poverty and into the middle class. It is a truly amazing success story, and it happened in in a very short amount of time, in one generation. That is what freedom and it is possible. Now you think of all these lefties. I remember them, going back a couple of decades. They're saying, don't buy these products, boycott these companies because they're using slave labor. And I want to make an important distinction. If you are forcing an employee to be there, or if you are bribing government officials in some third world country to force people to work in your factory, that is horrific, that is immoral, it is involuntary, and those companies should absolutely have their products boycotted. I absolutely agree with that. But when you throw around the phrase slave labor loosely, when it actually means a voluntary employment opportunity, some poor horrible wretch grew up in this horrific communist socialist country, earning pittance, 50 cents an hour, let's say, and you come in and offer $1 an hour, you have massive, you just double the quality of their life. That is very moral. Moreover than that, you gave them the opportunity to learn skills on the job and raise their standard of living, raise their skill set, increase their ability to contribute to the methods of production, and increase their value, and then they can go and seek better employment or go through promotions, and eventually their income goes up. And as I said, hundreds of millions of people in China and other countries around the world lifted out of poverty and into the middle class. None of this would have happened had there been minimum wage laws in China. If that happened, those people just would have rotted. They would have rotted in their socialist communist hell. Because so the government screwed them with a terrible education system, and then the government steps in and says, you're not allowed to pay these people less than X amount, even though they're worth less than X amount. So now the government screwed them on the education system, didn't make them a value that way. The free market offered to employ them and give them on-the-job training and make them more valuable over the time, and the government stepped in and said, no, that's not possible. And what you get is people trapped. You didn't get in China because they didn't have minimum wage laws. Here in the States, that's what they're doing, and they're raising them. And you get people trapped in this cesspool of poverty and unemployment. They didn't get valuable skills at school, and now the free market can't even provide them valuable skills on-the-job training in exchange for their labor. They can't even do that. So now you get people trapped in poverty for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And the next generation is absolutely horrific. At least those people, they had their parents who might have been able to pass on some skills to them. But what skills do these people who are trapped in poverty and trapped in unemployment for 30, 40 years, what skills do they have to pass on to their next generation? How to game the system. Marry this woman, put her in that house, get this government grant, get that government grant, get food stamps. That's the skills these people develop, and it's the skills they use to survive. And if I were them, I would be doing exactly the same thing. It's not their fault. It's this government disaster. And so now the next generation, all the skills that they learn from their upbringing is how to game the system. The skills that they didn't get skills that are valuable to the methods of production via school or via on-the-job training because no one was allowed to train them. And now you get this generational problem of people trapped in poverty and trapped in unemployment. The root cause is the government disaster of education system. If government got the hell out of education and it was a competitive environment, you would find a massive increase in the quality of education, plummeting costs to the point where education is almost free. I mean, as long as you can afford a tablet or a phone or a computer or something, or visit a public library, the ability to get incredible quality education online is now free. But still, we lock children in these these tombs where they're not allowed to talk, not allowed to think, speak when spoken to, and they don't get any skills that are valuable. So that disaster causes this issue where people come out of this, they leave high school, they're young adults, and they can't get a living wage because they're not valuable enough. No fault of their own, they're not intrinsically bad, they're not intrinsically stupid. The government screwed them with the government education system. Then, now with the minimum wage laws and the constant escalation of those, the free market is prohibited from giving them on-the-job training and giving them those skills. This is the circle of poverty, this is the circle of unemployment, it is government intervention, and it is a disaster. So please resist this wherever you can, or the generational effect of adding to poverty will just destroy the country. So that's my thoughts on that. Take care.